Hi everyone, and welcome to the first Australian ELSI Genomics seminar, ELSI Genomics Network seminar for 2024. I'm Ainsley Newson and I'm a Professor of Bioethics at the University of Sydney in Australia, and I convene the network, which is supported by Australian Genomics. And I'd also just like to acknowledge and thank Kitty Jean Laginha, who has done a lot of behind the scenes work to get this seminar going today. And today we're talking about a really interesting and important topic around engaging the public or publics, depending on your discipline, in genomics, and thinking about this from at least two places, which is Australia and the United States. And we're thinking about that with respect to a couple of genetic and genomic technologies, but I think the methods and the importance of them that we're talking about will play out across all of genomics. But before we get into that, I would like to acknowledge country. So I'm coming to you today from the city of Sydney in New South Wales, and I'm sitting on Gadigal land, and that is part of the Eora Nation, and that is unceded Aboriginal land. And it is a beautiful, too hot, but beautiful autumn day here. And I'd like to acknowledge elders past and present, and also, and very importantly, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander folks who are with us today or watching this recording. And we have likely an international audience, and for some of you, you may also be on unceded Indigenous land, depending on which country you're from. So we have two excellent speakers today. We have Professor Dianne Nicol and Professor Naomi Scheinerman. And I will just say a very brief bit about each of them, but they have a full biography, which is part of the promotion materials for this event. But Dianne Nicol is Emeritus Professor at the University of Tasmania, although I don't think you'd recognise that she's emeritus because she's very, very busy and doing lots of excellent things. But in her former, more formal professional life, was a distinguished professor of law and is now an emeritus distinguished professor of law. And she had for many years directed the Centre for Law and Genetics at the University of Tasmania. And she has a background in science as well as in law, and has worked in many really important policy questions in Australia and genomics in Australia over the course of her career. She's a fellow of the Australian Academy of Law and also the Australian Academy of Health and Medical Sciences. And she's very interested in the role of governance in personalised medicine, including genomics and data sharing, biobanking, genome editing, and other emerging technologies. And she's done lots and lots of work on patenting as well. And I will add, is just beloved in the Australian health law and ethics landscape. Naomi Scheinerman is an assistant professor of bioethics at the Department of Biomedical Education and Anatomy at the Ohio State University in the United States. And Naomi has a background in political and democratic theory, and she's worked in law, public policy, and philosophy, such a good mix. And she's super interested in deliberative democracy, as she will tell us a bit about today. But she also works on concepts like exploitation and consent, gestational surrogacy, whether it's okay to be paid in clinical trials. And she previously, before going to Ohio State, which is a relatively recent appointment as I understand it, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pennsylvania, and also has worked to do with Harvard and the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society, and has worked at the Hastings Center. So a really prolific career in bioethics in North America to date. And we're so delighted that Naomi is here today, especially giving up your evening to speak to us from the East Coast of America. So thank you. Okay, so for those of you who haven't attended one of these seminars before, the way it tends to work is we have the two presentations, roughly 20 minutes each, and then we open it up for discussion. Occasionally, these things take on a life of their own and questions start popping up immediately. We'll see how we go. It's a relatively informal discussion, very friendly, and the idea is that we get to hear interesting things and meet new people and ask questions. So very happy to hear from all of you throughout the session, which is timetabled to go until 1:30 Australian Eastern Daylight Savings Time. So depending on your time zone, that might be a little bit different, but about sort of an hour and 15 minutes from now, we aim to finish up. But if the conversation runs to a natural conclusion, then we will stop a little earlier. We'll see how we go. So without further ado, I will now hand over to Professor Nicol to give her presentation around the Australian Citizens Jury on Genome Editing. Thank you very much, Dianne.
Thanks very much, Ainsley, and thanks for the acknowledgement of country. I'll just mention that I'm in Nipaluna on Muhunyinja land, and I acknowledge everything that you've said already. I also want to acknowledge and thank you for your generous invitation and your generous introduction. It's really a delight to be part of this group, and thank you all for coming to hear us. It's really great to see so many people. So the idea is that Naomi and I are going to sort of do two similar presentations. I think given my background, I'm going to focus a little bit more on the legal and policy aspects and what can come out of public engagement in the context of genomics. And I think Naomi will focus a bit more on the actual methodology and on the theory of deliberation. So hopefully we'll segue nicely together. I thought I'd start, as Ainsley has said, that I'm sort of retired. But the question that keeps me from fully embracing my retirement, I've just written it out. To me, it's how we can make best use of law and policy to ensure that advances in genomics are incorporated in healthcare in ways that are not just safe, but also reflect ethical norms and social values. And to me, genome editing is an ideal case study to explore these things and to actually see how we can advance law and policy in this important area to make sure that we make the most of this technology, but recognize the profound social and ethical issues that it raises. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of genome editing and some of these issues to start with, and then get on to the Australian Citizens Jury itself. For this audience, I probably don't need to say that much about the technology, about what genome editing is. But I've just started off with this opening that my colleague Chris Rudge wrote in a publication we did together. He referred to it as exquisitely precise and targeted changes to DNA. So very different and more precise than previous forms of gene therapy. There's various forms with various strange acronyms associated with them. But the one that I'm going to focus primarily on is CRISPR. And CRISPR, it introduces editing machinery into cells, which cuts both strands of DNA, which either repair naturally or are guided to repair. And there's various different forms of CRISPR that are now emerging. Some of them only cut one strand and so on, but I'm talking about it in its basic form. So it can shut down, activate, and change gene function. And it's got applications across species, unlimited potential. The profound impact that genome editing can have was recognized by the Nobel Prize in Chemistry that was awarded to these two amazing women, Emmanuelle Charpentier and Jennifer Doudna, who really were the pioneers of CRISPR. And we're seeing already the promise. So Casgevy is the first therapeutic use of gene editing technology. It's now been approved in the UK and US and probably in other jurisdictions already. Essentially, it's a one-off treatment of really terrible blood-borne diseases, sickle cell disease and beta thalassemia. So a really promising technology, but there are already issues that are emerging. First of all, it's currently restricted to over 12-year-olds. The cost is huge, up to US $2 million per patient. And of course, the disease is most prevalent in sub-Saharan Africa. So there are issues there of how people can afford it and how it's delivered to those most at need. So it's already raising issues of equity and justice. And then, of course, there are more controversial applications of genome editing, as we saw with the announcement in November 28 by Professor Dianne, who announced that he'd used CRISPR to modify a gene relating to immunity against HIV in human embryos that he claims resulted in live births. And the claim is that there were potentially 3 live births. There were profound ethical, legal, and social concerns that were raised about this. And it actually resulted in him being imprisoned for 3 years for illegal medical practices. It's now been released, but it triggered extensive debate on the ethical, legal, social implications of modifications, particularly to the germline. And there's been recognition that depending on how human genome editing is employed, it raises difficult and different ethical, legal, and social implications. So we look at heritable versus non-heritable therapy versus an enhancement, whether it's being done for research or it's actually being done for therapeutic or clinical purposes. And there've been a mass of international inquiries, scientific and policy reports, and I've just summarized some of the key outcomes of these. So the general idea is that basic collaborative research, we can pretty much rely on existing regulation. Same for non-heritable forms. If we're looking at it in the context of therapeutic applications, use existing regulation, but it should be limited to disease and disability, not any forms of non-therapeutic or enhancement uses. And of course, clinical trials are essential. But different considerations apply where the editing might be heritable, might be capable of being inherited. It might work in the future, but we're certainly not there yet. And if this were the case, it would be only for compelling reasons with strict oversight. And the same goes for enhancement. And I've just highlighted a couple of things here that come from these reports only after public discussion. And for enhancement, we encourage public discussion and debate. So what I'm getting to then is, what might this public discussion and debate look like? There's no guidance in any of these reports. They just talk about it needing to be done, but that's as far as it gets. And I just thought I'd mention, because I'm obviously interested in the legal and policy aspects, what the regulatory environment looks like in Australia at the moment. And of course, Australia has a very comprehensive regulatory regime for anything therapeutic, as people will obviously know about here. Research has to follow the national statement. Anything that is going to be a therapeutic good has to go through market assessment, through clinical trials, and approval by the TGA. If it involves gene technology, it might require approval through the gene technology regime, although human beings that have undergone somatic cell gene therapy are excluded. And then we have general laws of tort and consumer protection and so on, and a whole array of other regulations and best practice standards. There's an additional layer for heritable forms of human genome editing that some of us are very familiar with. I particularly am, because I chair our Embryo Research Licensing Committee. And our legislation emphatically would prohibit the sorts of things that Dianne did. You can't undertake reproductive cloning or make heritable changes to the genome with a penalty of 15 years imprisonment. Can only create embryos by fertilization for reproductive technology. And you can only use XSART embryos under license. There's other considerations where we're looking at some of these new embryo models. And we had a raft of new changes recently when we're looking at mitochondrial donation. And of course, we have a strict 14-day rule. So there's that really strict regulatory environment. So do we need law and policy reform in Australia? If we do so, we've clearly got to bring the community into the conversation. And there's a whole array of forms of public discussion. It might be quantitative methods using surveys, or qualitative using interviews and focus groups and webinars and town hall meetings and the like. And then there's this other form of deliberative democracy, which Naomi will talk more about, but it's the idea that you use citizens' juries, citizens' assemblies, where you give people the opportunity to be informed and then deliberate for themselves on these really complex areas. I'll just give a flavour for how quantitative responses might look. This is work that I did back in 2018, 2019 with my dear colleague, Christine Critchley. Many of you will know that Christine sadly passed away in 2020, and she's still just so sadly missed by me, and I'm sure all of their other colleagues. And what we can see here is that the public at large really differentiates between health-related applications and enhancement, and has more concerns about enhancement and much more concerns about applications relating to animals for food than it does in relation to health applications. And if we look at health applications, you can see there are differences between applications in adults versus embryos and germ cells. So all of those differences are statistically significant, but we've got much greater differences between technologies than between the types of applications. We were fortunate to get funding from the MRFF in the first tranche of ELSI funding through the genomics mission to undertake a citizens' jury on genome editing in Australia. And it's part of a broader proposal where we hope to do a citizens' assembly at the global level. The question that we wanted to pose was, under what conditions or circumstances might the application of human genome editing technology be acceptable? So it's not looking at a simple yes or no. It's not a simple jury question. We wanted much more nuanced deliberation by our jurors. So these are the goals. I'm not going to read them all out, but it's this idea that we wanted to give people the opportunity to deliberate and develop understanding of positions and formulate shared recommendations on these issues, with the idea of assisting stakeholders and policymakers in their deliberations. From the research perspective, we wanted to show how effectively deliberation can be in this process. And we also wanted to create a film of the deliberative processes to use in further research. We managed to do all of this in pandemic circumstances. So just as we got the grant, the pandemic struck, and we thought, how on earth are we going to achieve this? We were just extraordinarily lucky in planning to do this process in this small period of time. June 2021, which many of you might recall, was at the time we thought COVID was over. So we had a small window of opportunity to bring people together, and we were able to bring them together at Old Parliament House in Canberra. Every pet body came together safely and went away safely. So we didn't have any COVID-related incidents, and we were just extremely grateful and felt we were really lucky. This group of what we refer to not as ordinary people, but as extraordinary people, were selected both for normal demographic selection, but also for discursive representation. And Naomi will spend a bit more time talking about this. This entails earlier interviews using discourse methodology. So they were given a series of 50 statements relating to genome editing and asked to rate how they agreed or disagreed with these statements. And we chose to ensure that we had people at all across the whole continuum of these responses. And so we got a real diversity of views coming into the deliberation. What we ended up with was broadly shared views on human genome editing. So we didn't have consensus, and I'll explain a bit more why it was okay not to have a consensus view on this area. But we certainly had recognition that this is really important technology. It should be used to alleviate human suffering, improve quality of life, and reduce childhood mortality. There's a real opportunity for the technology to be used in this way, but it's really important to have adequate research to assess benefits and risks to the individual and to society. The overarching ethical principles include consent and equity of access. So these were of paramount concern for the majority of our people. And many recognize that appropriate regulation is really important, and that regulation should include stakeholder and community education and input throughout and peer review. So a really sort of very refined, I think, a nuanced approach to this issue. But we did see more diverse views on some aspects of human genome editing, particularly when it came to heritable aspects. So there was some support for future applications of heritable human genome editing, but even those who felt that this might be appropriate in the future recognized there's need for much more research. And they said it should be limited. It should be limited to assist people, for example, to have healthy genetically related children. There were diverse opinions about what constitutes appropriate regulation, but most people were really very comfortable with the strict approach taken in Australia, but recognizing that it might be necessary to amend our legislation if we were to have more research. So it might be necessary to allow creation of embryos for research purposes, for example, but that should be done if no other option is available. So there was a real broad discomfort about creation of embryos for research, which currently is prohibited in Australia if it's done by fertilization, but recognition that research is important. So from this process of discursive discussion, we were able to identify various positions from this discourse analysis. So in even this small population of 23 people, we recognized that there were 6 different underlying positions. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of the real emphasize I can't find the right word, the extent of the disagreement in these positions. So there's position C is principal constraints, explicit normative or other opposition to human genome editing, whereas the libertarian revolutionary medicine position is that, look, ethics and regulation shouldn't really get in the way of individuals and parents' right to choose. So it's no wonder when you've got these diverse positions that you're not going to reach consensus on these points. But what the value of deliberation is in really understanding the underlying positions that people take, why they come to these conclusions. And from the overarching recommendations, we drew out 5 themes that we said should be really important in any further policy development when it comes to genome editing, making sure these values of equity and other values are drivers for human genome editing policy. ensuring that all forms, whether therapy or enhancement or other applications, are appropriately regulated. Recognizing that, and that policymakers need to recognize that there really are significant divergent views on the status of the human embryo. And in the end, difficult decisions have to be made about whether we allow, for example, creation of embryos for research, which some people might see as appropriate, versus those that feel that this just could never be appropriate. And we need to prepare for a future where heritable human genome editing might be shown to be safe and effective. Once this is the case, once those safety issues are removed, is this a future that we want? Is this a path we need to go down or not? Whatever the case, it's clear that we need to build meaningful public participation into these discussions around policy development and in governance of human genome editing into the future. So to me, this deliberation was a really powerful endorsement of these points. Potential limitations, complexity. This is such a complex area, and the different applications raise such different considerations. Inevitably, even though we had funding to do this over multiple days, there are still time constraints. Then we have to consider the role of experts. We had really great experts who helped inform the participants themselves. And I see the role of informants as being objective. They're objectively there to inform participants so participants can form their own views. Whereas others have the view that experts should actually be advocates for a particular position. And it's really interesting in feedback, a number of participants said, well, we didn't hear the other side. And there's this idea that there are sides to this debate. And what this told me is that I need to be clearer in discussing what the experts are there for with participants. In my view, it's really important to keep them as objective informants rather than as advocates. Another criticism was that from interviews we did with a cohort of experts and stakeholders afterwards, was they said, well, this is just really quite similar to the expert opinion that's already come up in the reports. Do we have a problem with framing here? And my argument there was, well, inevitably we wanted to frame this about what the expert reports were seeking, and that's why we asked them to be specific in the discussions rather than just being completely open-ended. But again, I need to focus more on this. There was some concern, and I think this is inevitable concern, about domination of discussions by vocal participants. And that emphasizes the role of the coordinator and the table coordinators to make sure that everybody gets the opportunity to discuss these things. And there will inevitably be trade-offs between representativeness, size, and deliberation. It's often said that, well, we need like hundreds of people in these deliberations to make sure that it's representative. I would balk at that. I think it's really important to have a small group so that you can actually deliberate in a way that people feel comfortable with and people feel that they have the opportunity to discuss. So I think discursiveness is more important than representativeness. And I'm sure there'll be questions about that, and I'm sure Naomi has a view on that. But to me, the lessons from the Australian Citizens Jury is that members of the public have extraordinary ability to engage with complex technology, complex ethics, complex law. I was at another forum last week that was focused on intellectual property, and people were saying, how can you get members of the public to engage with intellectual property is too hard, and my view is it's never too hard, and if it's too hard, it's because we're not explaining it properly. So it's up to us to find ways to explain it in ways that are amenable to the public. I don't think that we should expect consensus. We're not going to get it because there are so many strong views in this area. What we observed was a broad commonality of values, and we did have majority recommendations, but this really interesting diversity in underlying positions, which came out from the process and from the interviews, both pre and post deliberation. And to me, it illustrates the importance of inclusive and rigorous debate about risks and benefits of this complex and really ethically fraught technology, but it's potentially transformative and really scientifically important. And I also emphasize that a citizen's jury, to me, is not an endpoint. I mean, in some areas, it's been an endpoint. For example, it was used in Ireland to help drive the debate about whether or not abortion should be legal there. And that was a yes or no answer that was presented to jurors. Citizens' juries, in my view, are more important in helping set the agenda for future discussions, and not an endpoint of themselves, but a valuable step. And as we've seen in mitochondrial donation law reform, Ainsley and her team a few years ago undertook a citizens' jury on mitochondrial donation, and subsequent to that, there were really detailed public consultations that the NHMRC did, including doing their own citizens' jury, but they also did webinars and stakeholder workshops and surveys and so on. And I think inevitably in areas like this, which are so complex and so potentially unclear in terms of community views, we need to use that full armory of public perspectives to really better understand what the public think about these areas. Just quickly, I just want to acknowledge my funding. I want to acknowledge that although I'm chair of the Embryo Research Licensing Committee, I'm speaking entirely as an independent law academic. And I have a great team here at the University of Tasmania, but for this particular project, I had great collaborations with people from Canberra, Sydney, and Adelaide, and our science documentary collaborators at Gene Pool Productions. And I've just put a link there to the YouTube film that was made of the citizens' jury by them. And I'm happy for my slides to be shared so that they can, so people can look at that. And that's it from me. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Professor Nicol. That was such a rich presentation and clearly an indicator of the real depth that your participants went to in the debate, in the event. Sorry, I should say in the jury. So, there was a question in the chat, but Rebecca has already answered it. So there's no need to raise it to the whole group. But just for the recording, Regan Tytherley had asked whether the table coordinators were participants or whether they were facilitators. And Rebecca Paxton has clarified that the coordinators were facilitators and not participants. So thank you for that. We'll now move on to hear from Professor Scheinerman, and Professor Scheinerman is going to talk about her work with deliberative mini-publics in the US and the role that this plays in regulatory oversight of gene editing there. Thank you so much, Naomi.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's wonderful to be here, and perhaps more importantly, happy Pi Day, everyone in Australia. I'm very excited for myself for tomorrow. I want to acknowledge that the Ohio State University is currently situated on both the ancestral and contemporary lands of the Shawnee, the Delaware, Miami, Peoria, Seneca, and others as a land-grant institution. So today I'm going to be talking about deliberative mini-publics and regulatory oversight in the US context, as well as a little bit in the international context. To do so, first, I'm going to go ahead and go through somewhat quickly. So please, happy to answer lots of questions at the end about some more specifics, philosophical underpinnings, examples and models, design details, and indeed, as Dianne articulated, there's lots of trade-offs that might happen when designing mini-publics. It depends on what purpose and what institutional location and what question the mini-public is asking, and as well as the selection mechanisms, who gets to participate as a key underpinning of democratic contribution in the first place. And then I'm going to apply these findings to my thinking in the US regulatory context. And we're going to discuss US regulatory approaches to gene editing, current pathways for participation, why I think they're insufficient, and how mini-publics can help fill this democratic deficit, before moving on very quickly to international contexts as well. Oh yeah, and lots of this is based on my research and argument in my book manuscript called Democratic Theory and Emerging Technologies. All right, so deliberative mini-publics, what are they? Deliberative mini-publics are randomly selected assemblies of lay participants that contribute to policy questions through facilitated deliberation. So their key features that unite all of them is that there is some sort of random selection, and we're going to talk about what does random selection mean, how do you do that? There's moderated deliberation. They're expert-driven, so as was discussed with the Australian citizen story, experts are present, they play an active role in education, but not necessarily during the deliberative aspects at these tables. They vary on lots of other factors. So first in name, but name often connotes their type. So they might be called citizens' juries, citizens' assemblies, consensus conferences is a Dutch model, citizens' initiative review, deliberative polls, planning cells is a German model, etc. And based on that, they differ in size, temporality, so how often they meet, whether or not they're permanent parts of institutions, or they meet one-off or a couple weekends throughout a couple months period of time. The institutional settings, so whether or not they're part or in conjunction with a governance body. Whether or not they have decision-making capacity. Are they there merely for guidance versus they have real power and authority in the end decision? And importantly, are they paid? So we're going to talk about payment as an important factor for decreasing barriers to contributing and participating. Why might we want deliberative mini-publics? Well, insofar as we think about democracy as a place where we equalize power, where we want to empower people to have a sort of creative kind of power and authority over the determination of what society does, we think also then that the current democratic institutions suffer from this kind of democratic deficit, meaning they're not able to equalize the conditions of power quite enough to be considered fully stable democratic institutions. And so they require some reform and modification. Indeed, some people go insofar as to suggest that this process of using deliberative mini-publics, also referred to as sortition at times, should actually totally replace representative legislatures and institutions. That, and I can speak from the US context that in the representative bodies that we have, the argument goes, they've become so co-opted and removed from the interests of the people that actually replacing them with a random selection of people is a preferable way to garner a kind of mirror representation of the people, where the legislature actually looks like the people. Other people don't necessarily go that far and say that they should be a full-scale replacement, but rather they should use in conjunction with the workings of the legislature and other bodies. And I'm going to talk about the regulatory agencies in the US. And in so doing, they reduce barrier to inclusion. So there's lots of pathways for participation in the US, but the argument is that you have to often know what these pathways are, have the time and means to engage, and it often therefore doesn't actually capture a proper kind of representation of the people. And therefore you create more diversity in the deliberation. So even more than just mere representation, this aspect of diversity is really important. And I argue that that's for three main reasons. One is that increases the epistemic benefits of the people, of the knowledge produced at the end of the process. Second, that this creates a kind of justice enhancing outcome, because you reduce the problem of domination, of this idea that policies are going to be arbitrarily decided and not necessarily based on the needs or wants of the people. And this in turn will cultivate trustworthy institutions, that you're going to increase the outcome of this is going to be increased trust in the institutions that convene many publics. And I argue this creates a kind of feedback cycle, that this helps to reduce the problem of domination and create more epistemic benefits. Now, as mentioned before, the sort of gold standard of deliberative mini-publics is this Irish Citizens' Assembly, which helped pave the way for abortion rights as well as marriage equality in Ireland. And it did so by a citizens' assembly of a couple hundred people was convened, and they decided that these issues were so important that they actually needed to put them back to the people in the form of a referendum. And this large majority of the people did vote in favor of legalizing abortion and same-sex marriage in Ireland, a traditionally conservative country on those topics. So it sort of upheld as sort of the ideal of what a citizens' assembly can accomplish. But there are lots of other examples of where and when citizens' assemblies have been, and other kinds of mini-publics have been used. So I have selected some cases of genetically modified organism examples because it's closely related with with CRISPR and gene editing, which we were talking about. So consensus conferences have been used in Denmark and Australia in 2000. Citizens' juries, also the model that we just discussed with gene editing, been used in France, Brazil, and Denmark. And largely this is to discuss the safety and efficacy of genetically modified organisms. Are they desirable? Do we want them in society? How risky are they? What kind of oversight do we want of the process of making them? And ultimately in the US, a huge part of the debate has hinged on labeling. And there are more examples here. And there are lots of other examples. Actually, in my next slide, I have the World Health Organization very recently came out with this document called Citizen Engagement in Evidence-Informed Policymaking, a Guide to Mini-Publics. So I'm happy to, after my presentation, I'll put the link in there for how to find it. It's a really wonderful document. So this walks you through lots of the decisions and the sort of trade-offs that one might make when convening mini-publics. So we're going to talk about some of them right now. And so I put a chart here for thinking about what kinds of questions mini-publics must address when organizing them. And lots of them, and again, entail kinds of trade-offs. Do you want, as Dianne said, larger, maybe more representative, but then you have maybe less deliberative quality in the outcome because you have so many people there? Do you organize them into lots of smaller mini-publics and then you sort of average their outcomes? What kind of decision mechanism you use really can vary based on the need and the policy question. I'll emphasize a couple of things here that I feel quite strongly about in this space. One is that you really need to provide childcare, travel costs, food, and lodging for all participants. Insofar as you're trying to truly gain a more diverse group of people than the institution ordinarily would be able to reach, these are essential components for reducing barriers to entry. Another question here is around, actually, let's do that on the next slide. The selection, how do you select people? So on the left, I have a chart, the beautiful visual from the Australian Citizens Jury around how people were selected, and it was based on attitude, what I call attitudinal representation. And so there's two different kinds of representation you might want. One is attitudinal and the other is sort of demographic. So one example of that is the public dialogue on genome editing in farmed animals that the Nuffield Council in the UK organized. And they are not alone in this. Most mini-publics, most realms select based on demographic representation. There are arguments, however, that might be problematic because often these sort of social identifiers are a proxy for other things like attitudes, like experiences. And so if you're looking for those attitudes and experiences, then maybe you should just select for diversity based on those lines. And so, sorry, I was out of order. So then you have a select. What kind of randomization are we talking about? So there's one option, which is just fully randomized. That's the true sort of phone book style. You open it up and you invite 1,000 people from it and you hope that 200 come, which is about the return. But then there's stratified sampling, which is where you want to get certain percentages of the group to have certain ideas or certain views or represent certain populations. So you want at least a couple of people, for example, to have the view that technology is absolutely horrible. We should never use it. We should live alone in society. You want that view represented versus the transhumanists who think that this is really going to take us to the next level, and everyone in between. And so you pick at random from those groups of people who represent those views. All right, so now I'm going to move on to how I think we can start to incorporate the use of a mini public in the US regulatory context, which is hypothetical. It hasn't been done. The US has not experimented with mini publics nearly as much as Australia and Europe and lots of other locations. A lot of places in Africa have around the GMO question, and India as well. So the US is actually lagging, and Canada has done a lot of using mini publics, including in electoral reform. So how might we begin to incorporate, especially around CRISPR technology, into our regulatory framework? Well, to begin, what is that regulatory framework? So the US federal regulatory agencies, when they were approaching the question of CRISPR, updated their coordinated framework for the regulation of biotechnologies to think through how the USDA, which is the Department of Agriculture, and the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, should handle these kind of competing and overlapping regulatory questions and assigned jurisdiction to each of them. One of the big questions that has come up in the regulatory approach that really is inherited from the GMO question is whether or not CRISPR presents a new process or a new product. Should we think about CRISPR as a totally different gene editing, as a different kind of genetic modification, and whether or not that was a different kind of breeding technique, for example, than we had ordinarily seen in normal domestic breeding processes? Or should we just evaluate it based on the product? At the end of the day, is the sickle cell intervention safe for the patient, regardless of how it came about? And so there are lots of different questions about this that have been placed back and forth, but ultimately it was decided largely that we should focus on product, that it was a not necessarily different kind of process, and there's lots of debate in that realm. So the US started to see lots of different products hitting the market, first through the USDA approval of various plants, as well as overlapping with the FDA because it's about human consumption. So this is a kind of cattle that has shorter hair to make it more comfortable given warming temperatures, and therefore to make its greater longevity and comfort. And finally, as was mentioned before, the very important sickle cell disease treatment was approved by the FDA last December. So there are only a couple different kinds of ways that people can enter the conversation in the regulatory level and thinking about safety, risk, access to technologies, and the kind of moral questions that often enter regulatory conversations, even when they don't always address them per se, but are very much dealt with and have implications down the stream for justice and equality and access kinds of questions. So a couple of these methods are the FDA has advisory committees and panels on which there is often a patient representative. And so these are the main recruitment areas where they are looking to have more patient representatives, for example. There are other kinds of opportunities, including patient-focused drug development, patient preference initiatives, patient engagement advisory committees, et cetera, et cetera. You can also organize a sort of lobbying kind of group. So there's also always the opportunity of activism and patient advocacy groups. One concern with those is that patient advocacy groups are often organized and funded by pharmaceutical companies as a way to push through their medication. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that medication is bad or it's not wanted very much by the participants in those groups, but there is a conflict of interest there, and not necessarily a clarity on whether or not there's great diversity or representation in what the people want when it comes to the decisions. So the main mechanism through which people are able to, anyone is able to participate in FDA decision-making. And I'm focusing on FDA because it's my institution of choice. It's the one that has the most implications for drugs and medicine and development. And this applies also to the other ones, to the USDA and EPA as well on CRISPR questions, is through the public comment process. So when the rule is being promulgated, an agency has to publish the draft of the rule on the Federal Registrar, and people are able to comment publicly, and they are required, according to a law called the APA, to consider the comments, although not required necessarily, as we'll discuss, to make decisions on the basis of those comments, so they can disregard them. And this happens at this point in this process. And what I would argue is this is not enough. This is not a sufficient enough kind of mode of including the people in decision making. And that's for a couple of reasons. The first is that it doesn't have clear influence on the ultimate decision. The second is because the agency is not legally required to actually take seriously any of the comments, even as it is, by the way, required to respond to them and say, oh, yes, we heard this comment, but we're not doing anything despite it. The second is that there are too many barriers to participation. To be able to know when a comment is posted, to be organized, to have the time to comment, especially since COVID, they're all online. There used to be more town hall styles ways of participating, but now you need access to the internet and technology. This creates underrepresentation of certain vulnerable groups. And then there's the problem of capture, which is the overrepresentation of industry over that of public interests. And this is well documented as a problem in the comment period. And as a result of that and the non-obligatory binding nature of the comments, this creates insufficiently representative and democratic institutions, which, by the way, they were never meant to be democratic institutions. They were meant actually to be pretty removed from the wants of the people as a sort of US progressive era idea around objective decision-making and policy. Nevertheless, they clearly have implications on the people, and there is a reason to therefore think through why public inclusion in the form of a mini-public can actually help and enhance the decisions that they come up with. And so there you go. So one example of this kind of overrepresentation of industry in the comment period, I took a look at one of the draft rules that had been published in the Federal Register on human gene therapy products incorporating human genome editing. This is a draft guidance for industry. This is very common to have draft guidance for industry instead of actually making a rule for industry that they have to follow. Guidance documents are very popular because industry doesn't like rules. They want the guidance and they want to sort of have more of a back and forth relationship with regulatory agencies, which has not worked out great in a lot of cases, particularly Boeing. But nevertheless, this has happened in this case. And you can see that there are only 23 comments, which made it pretty easy to analyze. And sure enough, I found that most people were from biomedical sciences, from foundations, from interest groups. And most recently, in January 2024, actually, I taught about this in a law school class on the FDA. The day that this document came out. And so we all looked at it together, and sure enough, they had incorporated some of the comments, but they were largely from industry, showing that there is a lot of overrepresentation of captured influence. And so how can many publics maybe intervene in this process to make the decisions that come out of US regulatory agencies more in line with public interest and create more purchase in the sort of moral concerns that people have? So I agree we should so instead of just having the process of public comments here, we should put a mini public earlier in the process during the identify issues and gather data. This contributes to another idea in democratic theory around agenda setting power, that people should have the ability, as they did in the Australia citizens jury, to be able to say, here are the moral concerns that we have, here's what we want to think about going into the rulemaking process. And that is a better place for people to intervene rather than reviewing documents. And so just very quickly, I will say that this extends to other areas of analysis. So after the Australia Citizen Story is in part a test case for this idea of a global citizens deliberation on genome editing, this global citizens assembly, where we can include a large swath of people from throughout the world. And the proposal is that they can come together and have a similar kind of influence on policy making and collecting the values of the people in doing so. And I had made an argument also around this time that as the Human Genome International Commission was coming out with its reports on heritable human genome editing, that institutions like the International Commission would also be a good location to include a mini public alongside it, to conduct a kind of deliberation along the same kinds of questions, and for them to reconcile with what the views of the people are alongside what the views of a cloistered group of experts would be. All right, so the main argument that I've had here, the main takeaway, is that situating a deliberative mini-public early in the US regulatory making process offers a promising, again, not tried yet, way to include a diverse array of lay participants in the decision-making process. And this is in order to garner more knowledgeable, justice-oriented rules, and ultimately then trustworthy oversight institutions, which the FDA very much could use. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to enter Q&A.
Thank you so much, Professor Scheinerman, and just such a clear example of some of the deficits in current practice and also the importance of the processes that you're advocating for, but also the importance of doing those in a way that is attending to structural injustice and other ways that folks may not get a seat at the table. So we have just under half an hour for some questions, and we've got a great number of people in the seminar still, and we want to provide a great Q&A for people watching the recording as well. So there's a couple of ways we can ask questions. The first one is you're welcome to use the raise hand function. That'll allow me to see you, and you can unmute, turn your camera on if you wish, and ask your question. The other thing you're welcome to do is pop your question in the chat and I can read it out on your behalf. And so while you're thinking, I want everyone to get their thinking caps on, and you can ask a question about the method, its rationale, about the topic area, about the specific results of Professor Nicol's research and the way that Naomi's approaching things in the US. While you're all thinking about that, I'll start with the first question. I actually have quite a lot of questions prepared, but I don't want it to be the Ainsley show. So we'll hopefully some other people will come up with some points as well. And I guess Dianne and Naomi, you're also very welcome to ask each other questions as well, because I know that you are previously familiar with each other, but may not have had a chance to have a significant interaction over time. So I think the first question is one that maybe both of you could have a go at. And it came out, Dianne, from your comment as your fifth theme in your talk around the importance of public participation in governance. And I guess it got me thinking about this relationship between regulatory process and how and when and the extent, I guess, of stakeholder input. But Naomi, I think a really provocative kind of point in your talk that I think has come up in the debate, I'm not sure of your own position, but this sort of idea that, well, you know, why do we have regulators? Why do we have legislators? Actually, should we just completely replace those types of processes with members of the public who maybe might actually be able to better respect our interests? So just a really low complication question to start with there. So, you know, what are the contours here around the how, when limits of public participation in these regulatory processes?
Do you want to go first, Naomi, or I can attempt to add to start the discussion around this topic, but it's a really big question, and I know we've been thinking about it quite a bit in my group, how we actually build in public participation as an ongoing process, not at the start of the discussions around policy reform or midway through, but on an ongoing process, particularly as technologies evolve over time. It's really important to do this. I think it's really important to see that we need to engage on an ongoing basis, but it's extraordinarily difficult to achieve in reality. You know, I always go back to my experience with human research ethics committees and the incredible work that the so-called layperson does on the committee. It's so important to have their voices, but it's also important to make sure that they don't over time become experts. So you need to sort of think about refreshing all the time to make sure you have what might you call a sort of a truly, I'm thinking of the word naive, but I don't mean that in any pejorative sense. It's really important to have people involved who are coming at these issues with really fresh ideas. Yes, so important, but I don't have absolute answers on how we achieve it.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Naomi, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, you need significant amount of resources. And there's a lot of conversation around sort of cultivating a culture of civic participation that goes alongside that. I think that what also goes with resources is giving people time off. You know, one of the original ideas around this was to have a day of deliberation where everyone participates in a mini public of sorts or a deliberative forum kind of assembly. And so you need time and institutional space, and you need a lot of political capital. So you need a lot of public support and media that portrays it. You know, it always comes down to media, right? You need a media that portrays it in a way that's productive. You know, criticizes when that is, of course, due and important to do so, including, for example, there's a concern that many publics will sort of be used as a prop of politicians in order to push through their agenda and seem popular. Oh, we convened a citizens' assembly and look, they supported us. So you want media to call that out when that happens. I think that's a good use of them to make sure that it doesn't erode the legitimacy and potential for them elsewhere.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, your answer there leads into the second question I was going to ask, assuming no one else has a burning one just yet. I can't see any. And I think it's this, I mean, in Australia at least, which is where my experience is, what I observe is that, you know, there's some really fabulous deliberation going on across lots of different topics. But so far as I know, with maybe the exception of the mitochondrial debate in Australia, where the National Health and Medical Research Council was tasked by the federal government and given, you know, resource like people, a committee, a small amount of funding to actually do a really in-depth deliberation. And the NHMRC is kind of it's a government body, but it's kind of arm's length. It doesn't make decisions. It feeds information back up to politicians. But apart from that particular example, when it comes to deliberative methods of engagement, I can't think of another example where that has happened. And so we have lots of awesome researchers who have got excellent capability of doing this type of work here in Australia, and I have no doubt in the US as well, and I would count you among those. But it's kind of this question around, is this actually sustainable? Because we're sort of all asking for research funding to make this happen. But at the same time, we're independent, and so we can perhaps ask and answer questions with less concern about this appropriation and or industry influence, which, you know, if it's going to happen, it needs to be absolutely transparent and there for everyone to see. So I guess it's a bit of a treatise rather than a question, but I think it's this, I'd love to get your thoughts, I guess, on, you know, I think we've all demonstrated, the two of you have demonstrated really clearly the value and importance of deliberative methods as one aspect of getting public views when it comes to regulation of emerging genetic and genomic technologies. But at the same time, I think we're trying to do this in a model that is very there but the grant gods go I type thing. You know, we can either be funded or not, and then it will either happen or not, with only a couple of, you know, exceptions where governments have actually enabled this to happen via a different pathway. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. Like, do you think that's okay? Is there a better model? Whose job is it to ensure this that this deliberative engagement happens?
Yeah, it's difficult, and I will say that it is. The model that I describe is really incredibly expensive when you think that you're bringing together a group of people to deliberate, and all of the associated people that go alongside that, the experts, the facilitators, and so on. You're paying for their airfares, for their accommodation, giving them some recognition of the time that they've spent, that, you know, for childcare and all the rest, as Naomi said. So it's certainly not a cheap way of engaging in public participation. During COVID, a number of people tried to, did do deliberative processes online, and I just think that, yeah, good on them, but it would be really quite challenging, I think, from the perspective of the people running the deliberations, but also from members of the public. I mean, we all know that we can be on Zoom for an hour and a half or so, but by the end of that time, we're really running out of steam. So if we do want to find processes that sort of employ these strategies, and we want to do it in an online way, we're going to have to modify the way we do things a little bit. I think that's feasible, and it's a it's a much reduced cost expense, but there are some things that you would lose in the process. Conversely, when you're looking at the cost, yes, it is expensive, but if you look at the other expenses that are involved in looking at policy reform, for example, particularly if you're engaging with consultants, there are a lot of expenses there, and the expense of bringing people together might be quite small by comparison. So I think we need to look at this from the broader perspective, and sort of, I think, recognize that this is money and time that's well spent. So I don't have an answer, but there are all those issues to consider.
Yeah,
Thanks.
I agree with all that. I do find some of the literature on the internet, on the online deliberations, promising, insofar as it seems like it works too in its own kind of way. Will it scare you to also hear that they're also experimenting with bots as moderators, like to try and automate moderation? So that's one way to cut expenses also. But yeah, I think that what's interesting about a lot of critiques of mini publics is almost always the critiques go tenfold for the status quo, the sort of concern around expense, the concern around what happens if they show an extreme view. I think that there's a lot of, we should take very seriously reforming systems of power and redistributing power. And that is an important moral challenge for us to confront. But there's also sort of an interesting kind of irony to sort of concerns around, wait, what? Give people power that that doesn't take as much seriously whether or not it truly wouldn't be preferable to the current system, and whether or not the sort of concerns of the current system aren't seen like exponentially.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really thoughtful answer.
Ainsley, could we
yes,
go to Regan's point? She made a really interesting point about the role of the table coordinators and facilitators.
Yes, sure.
And this issue of bias, I think, it's really quite an important one to address. And I would love to hear Naomi on this, that how we deal with this question, because inevitably, whenever a researcher is engaging with a member of the public, we do we do bring our own views and our own biases, and it's really hard to avoid that. It's hard to say that we can bring a completely objective, open mind to anything we do. So the issue of bias is always going to be potentially be raised whenever we've got things like this. And I don't know, Naomi, are there ways of addressing that from your perspective?
Yeah, I will say that the training of moderators isn't really my forte. Something that I did read that I thought was really impactful was thinking about training people to notice modes of speech that are power creating versus power taking away of other people. So the kind of speech that, instead of the content of the speech, but to train moderators to think about when somebody hasn't been talking for a while and why that might be, and why it's hard to contribute to a group conversation. I'm an instructor, so I think about this a lot. That there are different people might have. It might be easier to write. It might be easier to process alone and come back to the group and talk to one person versus. So think about people who take over conversations and need to quiet down a little bit, and the ways in which to focus on that rather than content as much, and to make sure that people, and also just the rules of kind conversation around having I feel statements, and like being able, there's a lot in deliberative theory that's like a really kind of beautiful concept around vulnerability and like the therapeutic model of communication that I think is, the kind of thing that you can focus on cultivating instead of, checking sort of the kind of concern around like the fact-checking bias that might emerge.
Thanks, Naomi. That was really great. Yeah.
Absolutely. I just want to kind of sit down and talk to you for a lot longer, actually. So we'll have to get you to Australia at some point. That would be so great. Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of virtual versus in-person discussion, I am certain there must be someone in attendance that has a question. But in the meantime,
Rebecca has a great one.
Oh, okay. Has that just popped up literally in the last 15 seconds? Excellent. Okay. Thank you, Rebecca, for asking a question. Would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Yeah, so
thanks, Rebecca.
I did participate in the organisation of the Australian Citizens Jury. And one of the things that it brought to mind for me was that one of the benefits of the Citizens Jury is basically that you get to hear a lot of people's effective sort of emotional responses and their ethical sort of queries and rationales for their positions. But I'm not sure how well they necessarily get translated both through us as researchers and then into policy. And I think as researchers, it's difficult for us to necessarily advocate for a position that's not, fact-based. But what role should organisers of deliberations have in sort of communicating those positions, those rationales, and potentially also even advocating for those non-factual, in quotation marks, positions?
I agree. That is a fabulous question. I wonder, Naomi, if you would like to have first go at giving your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I'm sort of still digesting. I'm reading the written part. Oh, that's so interesting, because I tend to think about mini publics as we've done a lot of research. We know that they're very helpful. So I think this gets back to sort of Ainsley, like part of Ainsley's question that we didn't really touch on, which is that, well, what are we waiting for? Like, what kind of evidence do you need to actually situate mini publics in positions of authority alongside, or maybe in replace of, current institutions or experts or legislatures? And so that's sort of like, what's the tipping point? What's the point in which we think that we've accomplished enough to show that this is a good idea? I think we're there, but I think that there's sort of this problem of don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Like, we need to wait until we resolve everything, and in order to really be able to press go. And against political capital, it's a momentum kind of problem, and sort of these are really weird and different, and it's really hard to change. But that doesn't quite answer your really thoughtful question. So I had sort of imagined, will we create a mini public within the regulatory agency? So it's less about how a researcher communicates to the regulator that we really should do this, and more about this particular view of CRISPR that the citizens jury has come up with is really important, but rather that the mini public is really important, and therefore you should use that. That itself is like it's a political process. In the US, you would just have to amend a law, which is like very easy. No, it's like very hard to do. I don't have a great answer. It's a great question. Politics are really hard.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have an answer to this either, Rebecca. I'm sure you'd be better placed than me to think about how we might answer it. So, but I'm not going to put it back to you. I do think that we, as participants and as the people who are organising the deliberation, have a responsibility to the participants to make sure the entirety of their views and, I guess, feelings and everything are conveyed in the best way that we can find to do so. I'm not quite sure how to achieve that other than by, I think, really talking frankly about this and explaining that we don't just rely on the fact-based conclusions. We don't just rely on the cold hard answers, the yes or no vote of the jury member, but we actually really look at them and look at their underlying positions, which is why I think the work that you did and that Simon Niemeyer has done in trying to identify these underlying values is so important. It takes me back to another deliberation that I participated in some years ago when we were debating in Tasmania about what would a Tasmanian biobank look like. And this was with our colleague, Mike Burgess from University of British Columbia, who's a real expert on citizen deliberation in biobanking and genomics. And we talked a lot about issues of consent and privacy and so on. But one of the big issues for participants was commercialization. And I use this quote quite often because it reflects that feeling of underlying values. The group just said, look, we just don't like pharmaceutical companies. And I think it's really important to reflect on that you know, that is a value that many people in society hold. So I don't have answers, but I do think it's important for us to make sure we include those non-fact-based responses in our reporting of these things.
Thank you to you both, and thanks, Rebecca, for your question. And Dianne has raised a point about expense, which we have touched on in the discussion already. And yeah, Dianne, I think your question is actually a really good one that I might leave just to have as our final question, if that's all right. And you're very welcome to ask it in person at that point. I just wanted to ask I had a kind of practical question about method. I know some of the attendees at this discussion today are people who either have lived experience of a genetic condition or who work for a patient support group, and potentially both. And deliberative engagement talks about publics, and I'm just wondering about your view, if you have a quick view to say about kind of the role that people with lived experience and patients play in a so-called public deliberation event. And so what the balance might be, if you have a view on that, I'd really like to hear your thoughts about representation, I guess, and proportion of participants, etc. And also maybe their role as experts in providing evidence as well, because my understanding at least is that the debate on that has shifted a little bit in recent years about whether you should have a patient as an expert witness in a citizen engagement activity, for example. Maybe it's not quite a simple question as I thought, sorry.
I actually feel like no, it's a great question.
Mhm.
I think it's similar to the patient or, interest group. So the way I think about that is actually Michael Burgess talked to me about not having stakeholder groups as people who are representing institutions like stakeholder groups, even the patient advocacy groups, as members of the deliberation, that what you want is to actually isolate a kind of view that's separate from an institutional location. So if you want more patient views, then you use the kind of selection mechanism where you say, well, we're going to use stratified sampling and we're going to make sure that we get a bunch of patients at the table that don't necessarily have institutional affiliation. So we're not drawing from a group, but we're drawing from a patient population, and we're going to select from that. So yeah, I think there's definitely reasons to do that. I think there's really important to do that, reasons to do that. In particular, if you, if you're deliberating about sickle cell, you're going to want to have sickle cell patients there. Absolutely. I think you should do it in a way where they're not represented by a group, but they're speaking for themselves. Everyone's influenced by something, but I think that would probably be the way I do it.
Yeah. You just need to justify whatever approach you take. I think that's the critical thing. If you want to see one that did look at it very much more from the patient perspective, Anna Middleton and Richard Milne in the UK did a citizens' jury on genome editing, particularly focusing on heritable forms, and they only selected from patient groups. And so, it's inevitably it's going to be different because people bring a different experience, a lived experience, which is just incredibly valuable. But yeah, I think all of these things are really important and interesting approaches, but they have to be justified in the methodology why you choose that particular approach.
It's a really pragmatic thing. And I've just had a quick message from Dianne to say she's happy for me to ask her question. Thank you, Dianne. We have just literally kind of 3 minutes left. So Dianne asks a really important question, which I think is very likely to impact lots of us who work in this space, in that sometimes the way we get our funding is by being part of big consortia that are doing other types of research, and we're there to provide an ELSI aspect to a bigger project. And sometimes the question is, how can we justify the cost for this, I guess, as on its own thing as a justification, but also in big projects where significant resources are going to things like clinical sequencing, for example. So if you have a tight budget, how do you state your case for the value of this type of research? Hope I did you justice, Dianne.
Where are we without democracy? Yeah, I mean, in terms of scarce resource allocation is a huge problem. Competition for grants is mostly random rather than actually based on value. So I think these are, I'm willing to say at this point we've done enough experimentation time to start very seriously thinking about locating mini publics in realms of authority and having the government pay for them. That's one answer. And then the other one is that that these are more effective than any other kind of consultation. So they're more effective than citizens consultations. They're more effective than having your IRB representative. Like they're better tools to solicit what a population thinks in a particular kind of way, right? As Dianne has been saying, it just depends on the question that you're answering, but there's a lot of questions that they're better at. And so it seems worth it if you want to pool resources and really take very seriously this kind of approach.
Yep.
Thank you.
I agree. I think it's a great question, Dianne. And but the question is, if you wanted an ELSI person on a grant, it shouldn't just be the tokenistic, oh, you can just do the thinking for us. It has to be a genuine attempt to incorporate ELSI research into the whole process. So I think we've probably just got to be firmer in our stance of this is what it takes to do our research. And if you want us involved, you've got to accept that.
Yeah. And the intellectual case for what this adds over and above other methods, empirical methods of this type of work. Right. That was just so excellent. Thank you so much to both you, Dianne, and you, Naomi, for your wonderful presentations and your really thoughtful answers to the questions. So we will say goodbye and we'll see you again in around 3 months' time. So thank you so much for your attention today and for listening online, if that's what you've done too.
Thanks, everybody. It was great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.